It's so important to me to let survivors know that if you're dealing with migraines and brain fog and stomach problems and you catch every single virus that happens out there and you are dealing with a level of fatigue, the way I described my fatigue, I said, it's like my muscles don't exist anymore and my bones are just having to carry my body up a set of stairs. I have no access to muscles anymore. The electricity to my muscles is gone. So it's my bones trying to carry everything up the stairs. If you feel like that, you're not crazy. You're not crazy, you're injured.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 83, and this week we are extremely fortunate to have with us Jessica Michaels. In 1991, at age 22, Jessica was raped by Jeffrey Epstein. This is part one of Jess's story. We're just going to dive into this powerful episode, and I'll catch you on the other side. Here's Jess. Jessica Michaels, welcome to the SAS podcast. I am so honored and privileged that you are here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave. I'm really honored to be here. I think your work is incredible and so necessary, and would love to be part of anything that helps progress it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to start off by explaining to my audience real quick that the way Jessica and I connected was because of my interview with Tracy DiTomasi with Callisto. And yes. Tracy mentioned you during her interview and told me how amazing you were. And I was like, who is Jess Michaels? And when she told me that you were a victim of Jeffrey Epstein, I was just shocked that there was someone who had gone through that experience and was talking about it in an open way. So I immediately went to your TED Talk. And
thank you.
That was such an impactful learning experience for me. So I reached out to Jess through her website, and she agreed to be on the show, and I'm just thrilled and honored. Thank you so much again. I usually just start off right off the bat by asking this question. Jess, what are you able to tell us about your sexual assault experience?
Thank you. And I'm so happy that you met Tracy, because I'm a big supporter of what Callisto does. I think that they are unique in a very unique space of post-assault, and the proprietary technology is amazing. So for anybody that didn't listen to that podcast with Tracy on it, please go back and listen and follow Callisto, because they are really a game changer in this whole issue of sexual harm. Where I start with my story generally, and as you saw in my TED Talk, is I actually talk about the day before, because I was a very different person the day before, on July 8th, 1991. I'd worked very, very hard to get to the status of being a working professional dancer and model and singer and actress in New York and Tokyo, traveling all over. And my career at 22 years old was on a trajectory, a really strong, solid upward trajectory. This is actually the hardest part for me to talk about, what I lost. I talk about in my TED Talk, I worked with MC Hammer when I was in Tokyo. I had billboards with my face on it. I was reading and rereading my name on my paycheck from being a backup dancer for Aretha Franklin. Got to meet her on the set of this video that I did of hers, and really felt confident, strong, powerful in my ability to succeed in a very difficult industry. And then I was connected to Jeffrey Epstein through my roommate, who had been working with him for months. She was also a professional dancer. She came home one day and told me all about this wealthy Wall Street guy that she met, who was training her to do massage. That's not actually in the 90s that big of a deal, because in the early 90s, I don't even think you didn't have a license to even do massage back then. Wow. And so as a dancer, we work on each other's bodies all the time. We even had talked about like, oh my gosh, we could do massage on the side and then we could be going to auditions. So she actually presented this fabulous alternative money-making opportunity that would help her still pursue her dance career. He took her all over the world in his jet, in his private plane. She was making a ton of money, and he was completely understanding about her having to go to auditions. And so for months, she's bragging to me about this job, and I'm jealous. I am jealous that she met him and I didn't. So it gets to be the end of June, 1991, and she's like, I got a dance job, I'm gonna leave. Do you want to meet him? He's going to need a backup person. And I was, heck yeah. I didn't hesitate. I was yeah. And the way she spoke about him was so admiring of him, that he took care of people. He really loved dancers. So I had no reason to be put on guard. This wasn't a stranger. This was my roommate that I had known for a year and a half, that I had worked with on my first dance job, a cruise ship. So the trust level was very different for me.
Yeah.
I met him at his office on Madison Avenue. And the reason I remember all this is because it actually was in my day planner. I still have all my day planners from when I was auditioning, because I was a big journaler and I didn't always have time to journal. So I figured keeping my calendars would remind me of all the auditions I had been to, all the people that I met. And it was just a great way to save memories for me. Sure. So I still had my 1991 day planner that had his name, his address, the phone number, the assistant that I was supposed to talk to, all of that in my day planner. So I go to his office, and this is kind of the weird thing, Dave, is that his office was on Madison Avenue, but when I went into his actual office, it really didn't look impressive. In fact, my first thought was, this guy's a millionaire? I wasn't even sure, because his desk looked like an old school teacher desk. Wow. Like it wasn't posh. It was not luxurious in any way. And so I sat down, and he's quizzing me on all of this stuff about the body and asking, and he's almost doing what I call like in sales with like the takeaway. Oh, I don't think you know enough about the body. I don't think you know enough about this. Well, I'm not really sure. And so you're going to need to study this book. So he has me come around the side of the desk, and he opens up a drawer. And in the drawer, there's about a dozen copies of the book of massage. It's the same book, just a dozen copies of the same book. And he hands it to me and goes, you're going to have to study this book. Now, this is the point I want you to remember. There were a dozen copies of that book in 1991. So when you hear about all of the things that were happening in the 2000s, I'm hoping your listeners' ears will perk up a little bit and recognize that not only was it happening in 1991, but he had a game plan going on with dozens of that book in 1991. So though I may be the earliest publicly known survivor, I do know there are survivors from the 80s. Mm-hmm. They just may not be public. And he had his shtick down in 91.
Wow. Yeah.
So I leave thinking, I'm not sure if I have this job or not. I'm going to go study this book as hard as I can, because I'm a perfectionist. I'm an overachiever, and I'm going to make sure I know every single technique and order and how to do this. Like, I'm going to study it like it's a job, right?
Sure.
Later that day, my roommate says he liked you, so you can call the office and make an appointment next week for a follow-up. And so I got a different address. And I actually had filled a notebook. I studied for that week, and I filled a notebook, and I made a little cheat sheet of like the order that you're supposed to do massage in. Like I was very professional in my approach. And so I get to a different address, and I don't remember where it was. I know it was on the east side, but at this address, there's a doorman that has to let me up to the apartment. So he has to use a special key. And he lets me up, and I walk into this apartment, and I go around this barrier, and all of a sudden I see floor to ceiling windows, a sunken in living room, a beautiful apartment, one that I had never seen before. And that was the moment I was like, oh, maybe he's a millionaire, I guess. Yeah. Like it really hit me. And then, so I walk in, and he's not there. And then he comes out from behind the barrier. I guess the bedroom was behind that barrier. So he comes out, and he's in a white bathrobe. I decided I'm going to let him know that I am not deterred by any of this. I'm a strong woman. So I ask him, the very first thing I asked him was, so Jeffrey, why do you hire dancers to do massage when you clearly could hire professionals? And he was like, oh, well, dancers have just beautiful bodies. They know how to take care of themselves. They often know more about the body than even massage therapists do. And he goes, and you wouldn't want a fat personal trainer, would you? And in that next moment, he goes to take off his robe and he says, and dancers are comfortable with nudity. And he doesn't ask me, are you comfortable? He says it and he removes his robe without looking for my, like he doesn't look to see what my reaction is. If you ask me when was the moment of shock starting to set in, or suspicion or fear or, trauma responses beginning, right. I remember my breathing chant was like, Christy never told me about nudity. He didn't tell me about nudity last week. I was not expecting that. I was like, but okay, I'm just going to be professional. I'm just going to be professional.
Yeah.
So he lays a towel down on the ground and he lays down, face down, and I start telling him, I'm thinking, oh, this is a trial massage, all right? So I'm going to grab my cheat sheet. I'm going to go through and I'm telling him about all the positions that I practiced. And we are talking a little bit, and slowly over time, things start to change to sexual jokes. Time goes by, and the only reason I know time went by was not because I can remember time going by, but I remember getting there and it was light outside, and leaving it was dark. So I know I was there at least an hour and a half or so, an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. So at some point, and I'm guessing it was probably about 40, 45 minutes in, he gets annoyed with me. His tone changes. So initially, I think he's this charismatic and smart, and I'm kind of going, ha, 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 at the sexual jokes and just sort of ignoring them and not going on with them. And then he gets annoyed. He's impatient. You're doing it wrong. And that is when everything changed for me. That was the moment of, if you ask me when full throttle my body changed in response to what was happening, where I started to just go into trauma responses, it was when he got mad. He's like, you're doing it wrong. You're going to have to take off your dress and let me show you how to do it. It's purely professional. And that's when it happened. I try to explain, to me, this is the most important part of my story, because this is where afterwards I turned it in on myself. I didn't understand that trauma responses are automatic. And so at one point when I am laying there and I can't move and I can't say anything, and I'm literally, at one point I'm yelling at myself, why aren't you stopping this? What's going, you don't want this to happen. Why aren't you moving? I even started to go past just a phrase response. Like I almost started to pass out because my eyeballs, I didn't leave. Some people say they leave their body. It's another reason why I didn't recognize that I was sexually assaulted. I didn't have the words for it. Right. Because I didn't leave my body and look down and see what's going on. I actually fell backwards into my body. And then what I could see out my eyeballs got really small, really small. Like I was actually going farther away from the scenario, but inward. And I think that's a really important distinction, because not everybody floats above their body when they dissociate.
Absolutely.
They can dissociate totally inwards. It's like, when you're starting to pass out and your window, that window starts to narrow. That's exactly what it looked like. The window is narrowing. So he finishes and gets up abruptly, and I hear the crumpling of paper. I could hear him throw it on the dining room table. And then he says, call my office next week for another appointment.
Wow.
And I don't remember, I was so dazed, and I don't remember putting on my dress. I don't remember how long it took me to get up. I remember going to the money and wanting to throw up and feeling like something's really wrong with taking this money. Like it felt really awful. Yeah. And at the same time, I couldn't define it, because in 1991, I believed the laws. I believed that the laws told me that it wasn't rape because I didn't fight and I didn't scream. I didn't resist. And so because of those laws, it didn't even occur to me exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. So I put the money in my pocket and it felt awful. And I left. I ended up getting on the subway going the wrong way. I was so disoriented. I couldn't speak the whole night. I got to work the next day. I was a scholarship student at Steps on Broadway. And for our scholarship as dancers, you worked the front desk. And so I go in the next day and I'm kind of dazed. My friend was like, hey, how you doing? How'd that interview go? And I can't speak. And she says it to me 2 more times. And I'm just looking at her and still no words could come out. And this is the next day. I still couldn't get words out.
Right.
And she grabs my hands, pulls me into the office, and I just break down in tears. And I tell her just a little bit of what happened, not even the whole thing, because I couldn't even not only could I not come to terms with it myself, but I was already too humiliated. So I tell her what happens. And even with that small bit that I told her, she looks at me and she grabbed me and she said, we have to go to the police. And it was her saying that made me recognize how bad it was. And I hadn't even told her everything. And so I was, okay, but who's going to believe a 22-year-old dancer next to this wealthy Wall Street guy? Like, nobody's going to believe me. And I didn't fight it. And I didn't scream and I didn't run out. And I walked past the same doorman that I had walked by when I went up. And nobody's going to believe me. In that moment, when I, on some level, decided nobody's going to believe me, I believe my brain, in order to protect me, just pulled the experience and I completely dissociated from it after that. Yeah. But I didn't escape the repercussions. And so that's my story. That's what happened.
Right. That's
why I didn't ever report. It's why I wasn't able to even understand what happened to me until I saw his name in the paper. And I saw his face for the first time 27 years later. And I didn't even remember his name. And all of a sudden I saw his face and my whole body started reacting. I was like, couldn't breathe. Right. My heart is racing and I see his face and I was like, that looks like the guy. The way I could only say was, this man did something bad. I couldn't even form the words when I would tell. I was like, this man did bad things. And I sent the article to a friend. I was like, this man did bad things, to my therapist. She's like, don't read the article. But I didn't listen to her. I went to sleep and I just cried all night. And I was like, no, I want to read what this article is about. And so I read it. It was the first time that I learned that this happens to other people. And all I kept saying in my head, Dave, was, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. I had no idea 27 years later the weight I had been carrying around in my head.
Jessica, are you able to talk to us about that 27-year gap? It really changed your life in so many horrific ways.
It did, and it's actually why I've worked so hard for I've been in trauma therapy since 2018, and it was in December of 2018 that this article came out that I saw it for the first time, and I think that if I had not had a therapist for that long of a time that I trusted, I can imagine that I wouldn't have even sought help. So I was very lucky to have had a therapist that I had already had for like 11 months that I trusted. It has been 6 years of purposely focused healing so that I can talk about this, because the devastation to my brain and my nervous system and my body and my relationships and my career and friendships and how I failed to progress as a young adult into life in a healthy way. It's why I did that therapy, so that I could talk about this. When my body froze, it got stuck in that freeze trauma response. And what we know now, we only have learned it in the last 5 to 10 years or so, that when that trauma response gets stuck, and if you're not surrounded by safety and trust and support in those first 3 months, it stays stuck.
Yeah.
And that lack of safety perpetuates this constant recycling of stress hormones 24/7. And that was me for 27 years. This just recycling of stress hormones. So if adrenaline is the go pedal for like a lion's coming, I've got to run, Cortisol is the stop pedal so that it stops the adrenaline from flowing. It was a constant flowing of both of those hormones. When that happens, the damage that happens within digestion, immune system, endocrine system, respiratory system, cardiovascular system, because the heart is going constantly, even into my muscular system, skeletal system, all of the systems of the body end up being affected. For me, it started off with looking like my face blew up in this cystic like acne, just bizarrely. And we can all understand that, right? When we get stressed, sometimes we get acne. That's what happens. We break out in pimples if we're stressed. So my whole face, like I took the palms of my hands and I covered my cheeks, my whole face. And it never happened before and it never happened since. It was 2 weeks right after that. Within 3 months, I was so filled with anxiety that I couldn't sleep at night, which was causing insomnia. And then I was on this vicious cycle of inability to sleep and then being exhausted during the day. And I was petrified to live in New York City, the place that I had worked so hard to get to, that I loved. I loved New York. So I couldn't even understand the words when they were coming out of my mouth to a friend. I was in Tokyo for a contract 2 weeks after the assault, a 2-month contract. And I remember I had to go back to New York and I was like, I'm scared to go back to New York. I didn't even know why I was saying it because I'd never been scared before. I couldn't make all the connections. It only took after years of therapy and understand, oh my gosh, I was afraid to go back to New York because I didn't want to get assaulted. I get back to New York. I just found a job out of New York right away. I want to be clear about something too, because this is the mindset that changed my life. When I couldn't move, when I froze, my idea of who I thought I was, because the day before, I'm a superhero. Yeah. The day after, I can't even protect myself from an assault. So my brain went to, you're so stupid. You can't even protect yourself. And I'm talking to myself saying, you cannot be trusted to take care of yourself. You are unsafe. And when that is your mantra playing in your brain, you are hypervigilant. Yes. You are scared of everything. Yeah. And I went from being this really strong, assertive, confident woman to this mouse of a person. I no longer trusted myself. And so what happens when you don't trust yourself? Then you're grasping at, oh my gosh, maybe I should get in this relationship because this person can save me. This person's stronger than I am. They'll be able to take care of me. I can trust them more than I trust myself. So then I become this very needy, paranoid, fragile, insecure relationship person. How it looked for me, how life looked for me right at that moment of launching into the world as a young adult completely changed. All of that perpetuated into stomach issues, immune system issues that slowly degraded my body over time, that by the time I was in my 40s, Dave, I had a level of fatigue. And I think the word fatigue is very misleading in that it's not fatigue. It's literally like I would get to moments in the day or moments in a week where the batteries in my body just ran out and I would crumple like a toy's batteries wound down. Right. And I could not get up. And it was explained to me later on that this is actually adrenal fatigue syndrome. Mm-hmm. I became so sick and I finally found a doctor. Like I was bedridden a majority of the day. In fact, I would be very excited to count, like I did 3 things today. I walked my dog once. I made breakfast. I was so sick, I didn't even bother to make my own bed. And the days that I could felt like they were unique and special and amazing because I actually got out of bed. I had to move home and live with my mom in my 40s because I couldn't take care of myself physically anymore. When I reached out and finally found a doctor, an adrenal fatigue doctor who specializes in this issue. In fact, he's written like 5 books on it. He got it as a doctor and going into practice, he got it, which is why he noticed he could not get help from Western medicine. And I said to him, well, I've had a lot of stress in the last couple of years and maybe that's it. I got divorced. And he's like, no. He goes, something happened to you. Think about it. Your late 20s, your early 30s. He's like, you don't get this sick from just 5 or 10 years. This is something that took decades for you to get to this degree where you are bedridden. And so I have now been healing and working on my healing journey, my physical healing journey, my emotional healing journey since I met him in 2017. Yeah, I've been working on it since then so that I could be here. And luckily, I'm very happy to say that as sick as I was, I still deal with bouts of it, but I've learned to manage it along with my anxiety. I can still get anxiety attacks. I can still have overwhelm because I still live with post-traumatic stress disorder, which I call post-traumatic stress injury because I'm injured, not disordered. That 27 years, I feel like, Dave, I found these words at one point, not that long ago, in the last years. I felt like a part of me went to sleep, went completely asleep at 22, and I woke up in menopause. The joy I felt when I was going through my healing, where my brain could calm down enough that I was able to see that I have a really good brain. My cognitive function is actually amazing. And to have looked back on my life, and I would imagine, though I appeared a certain way, I appeared like nothing was wrong because I was really good at masking it. The brain fog internally, I was a disaster. So the day my brain was clear, I remember the day my brain, from just the nervous system chaos and the chemical chaos calming down, just from all the rest, mental health support, healing the rest of my body. It was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And it's why I share my story, because I want people to know there is a bright side.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm thrilled that you're doing this episode. You're right. From the very beginning when we started, my listeners need to hear this. And I spend some of my episodes just me talking about that trauma response and what it does to our bodies, the cortisol, the adrenaline, that mixture, as you've described, this ongoing detrimental breakdown, not just emotionally, like you mentioned, but it does have an actual physical impact on all the systems that you mentioned. And it's cumulative. As time goes on, it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think that it's so important to me to let survivors know that if you're dealing with migraines and brain fog and stomach problems, and you catch every single virus that happens out there, and you are dealing with a level of fatigue, the way I described my fatigue, I said, it's like my muscles don't exist anymore and my bones are just having to carry my body up a set of stairs.
Right.
I have no access to muscles anymore. The electricity to my muscles is gone. So it's my bones trying to carry everything up the stairs. If you feel like that, you're not crazy. You're not crazy, you're injured.
Yes.
You have an injury that has happened. And that's why I'm so passionate about people understanding what happened in my journey, that it was an injury. I have post-traumatic stress injury.
Yes.
I'm not disordered.
No, I love that you say that. It is such an important message to get out there, that there's a purpose for every one of those chemicals in our body.
Yes.
And there are good
100%.
things that it can produce and protect us, because that's the main function of the brain. The number one goal of the brain is to keep us alive. But when it gets stuck, as you mentioned, that word stuck is such a great description of what happens. And those hormones, those chemicals just keep on revolving through your body.
Yep.
It's a degenerative disease, and it causes all the harm to your body that you are describing. You're like a textbook example of what this does. And so many people in my audience have these issues and talk about them, but don't know the words. You have become obviously educated in trauma response and what it means to be trauma informed, not just at an emotional level, but at a physical level. And I'm guessing that you are getting that education from your therapist and from the research that you're doing. Have you read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes, and that's one of my top 3. My other one is Peter Walker's CPTSD, Surviving to Thriving, because he breaks down the trauma responses and what you can recognize. It's much more layman terms, easier to read than Bessel van der Kolk's.
Yeah.
Highly recommend it. When I say I've been on this journey, Bessel van der Kolk has a page in there, I think it's 42, 43. It's where they took brain scans of people before they start talking about their trauma, and then when they start talking about it, they put them in the brain scan and what areas activate. They were surprised to find that the Broca's area lit up And that's actually the area that is affected, just like stroke victims, where they really struggle to get from what I am feeling to being able to verbalize. Like language is destroyed. So we can't talk about, like, when people say, why did you wait so long? Or why did you say it one way when you told me the first time, but now you're explaining it a different way? We're walking around like stroke victims. They can actually prove with brain scans that there is damage on that connection in the same way that stroke victims are damaged. Yeah. And you're asking us to repeat it in a way that activates that stroke area of the brain.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm hoping that the law enforcement element of my audience is listening to this, because we run into this problem all the time. I do. It's so frustrating when I do trainings and get out and teach what it means to be trauma informed and how the brain responds to trauma, the neuroscience of trauma and memory. And you're absolutely right. There's a part, I even have the slide that says trauma interferes with declarative memory. Trauma interferes with speech. Expect your trauma victims, your interpersonal violence victims, whether it's rape, sex assault, or domestic violence, whatever it is, expect your victims/survivors to tell it different every time, to not be able to tell it at all.
Yep.
Sometimes because it is such a drastic, dynamic aspect of trauma that you can't talk about. It just can't come out because of what it does to the brain. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that you brought that up.
Yeah, and people act like, oh, I just couldn't talk about it, meaning it was a choice.
Right.
As if it was a choice. The way that I described the way my brain dissociated, it was like my brain took the incident, pulled it to the back of my head, put it inside a steel locker with a steel door that I couldn't look at it all the time. But anytime I had a moment of vulnerability, that's the key word right here. And I want to hang on to that word just for a second, especially for your law enforcement people. A moment of vulnerability. I could look back at that door, and on the door it said, "You're stupid, you can't be trusted, and here's why." It didn't show me what was behind the door, but it was a message. Like I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I'm so stupid. Which would then further perpetuate vulnerability.
Right.
Which would then further perpetuate. So when people say PTSD activates because of a life-threatening situation, if you believe you are stupid and unable to take care of yourself in the world, you are scared to death all the time.
Yeah.
So any moments of vulnerability, like talking to a police officer, are going to activate all of that because of fear. And so we believe, my team and I believe, this has to be looked at as an injury first. Just like we would never, police officers would never, people would never come across a car accident with two bloody drivers, barely coherent, and start interrogating them on who went through what light. It would never happen because you can see the blood.
Yeah.
And you can see the damage. But if you look at a survivor as if there's internal bleeding going on that I can't see, what do I need to do right now to deal with that internal bleeding? I have to get that person to safety. I have to get them to somebody to make sure they feel safe. For us, that bleeding is a lack of safety. It's vulnerability. So if the first focus is, I don't have to interrogate, I just have to make them feel safe, that I'm there to help, that I'm there to make sure they are safe first and foremost. That word is huge for us, safety. We do not feel safe in the world at all. Right. Like I had to walk around in my 20s. I had mantras and they didn't necessarily work, but I was like, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe. I would be saying that all the time just to get through the day, constantly. And so first, focus. is to make us feel safe because there's an injury happening internally.
Yeah.
When we feel vulnerable, when we're vulnerable.
Describe for the audience, if you would, Jessica, what you were calling, your team is calling, how you're approaching this, because I love your program. And I don't know, maybe we shouldn't go into it at this point, but at least tell us what it's called, because I love the name.
We are calling it 3J's Sexual Assault First Aid, and we're doing it as a first aid kit in an app. And we're calling it first aid so that we're reminded that this is an injury first. And you don't have to be an EMT to do first aid, right? You're just triaging. You're just making somebody safe, comfortable, and making sure the injury isn't perpetuated into something worse. That's it. That's all you're doing. And so we believe that, look at my case. I listened to the laws. It's why I didn't know I'd been raped.
Yeah.
And so we actually don't give a fly and flip what the law says, because you can be injured and it not qualify for whether you're going to get a conviction or not. Yeah. And so if we first deal with the injury first, so this is what we also know. We know this from trauma research. There are studies that if you surround a trauma survivor in safety, support, and trust within those first 24 hours of an individual incident, and through those first 3 months, their nervous system is able to calm down. They're able to actually get out of being stuck. The switch can flip back to calm and not get stuck, and potentially never develop post-traumatic stress injury. Like we could completely change this if we just recognize that it is an injury first and dealt with it that way. And then maybe you're not going to have issues with language, issues with memory, because that person has had the opportunity to actually calm down, be surrounded by support, let the nervous system become regulated and safe, so that details can be remembered.
And I love that you mentioned that research has shown that. This is scientific. Yeah. This isn't hoodoo voodoo, psychobabble. This is known science. This is hard science, that if you do exactly what you talked about within that first 24 hours, actually you even mentioned that window of 3 months. If you show someone that empathy, that compassion, and you envelop them in that concept of safety, and confirm to them that we're all vulnerable, but at this moment we are surrounding you with safety. The impact that has in that first 24 hours, 48 hours, just moving forward for that person's life changes everything. It actually stops that cycle of perpetual damage that could be done instead. Exactly.
If we actually surrounded a survivor in support first, if law enforcement had advocates in departments that their one job was to surround that person in safety and make sure either they had their inner circle there to surround them in safety and support, whatever that person needed to feel safe, we actually believe that there's a greater chance of justice.
Absolutely. That's so true. Yes. Talk more about that.
Well, if people knew, it's from many angles, if people knew that was part of the process, not just, police officers being trauma informed, meaning how they ask the questions, but knowing when to ask the questions, meaning that's not the first thing that should happen. Right. That's not the first place they should be going, is to a police station. I'm sorry, it's just not the place where they're going to feel safest. That's not where right now where we're at. Yeah. One of my team members is an advocate in hospitals, and she's literally had to stand between a police officer trying to get to a rape survivor to tell them, look, you cannot ask her questions right now.
Yeah.
You can't do it while she's in the hospital about to have every orifice of her body swabbed and every uncomfortable question in the book asked. This is already at the limit. You need to back off. But it's not just about being trauma informed in how you ask your questions. It's being trauma aware enough of when to ask the questions and that shouldn't be the first response. Just like asking questions at a bloody car accident is not an appropriate time to be interrogating someone. You get the ambulance first.
Yep.
And we don't do that. We treat it as a crime before we treat it as an injury. That's the downfall for survivors. This is so treated as a crime first. And we're saying, it was actually Tracy from Callisto that told me is this quote that she heard that I now use all the time. And she doesn't remember where it's from, so I apologize, I cannot credit it. But something can be awful, but lawful. And where we are missing the mark is that something can be really terrible, it is unprovable, and nobody is looking at that injury. Well, it wasn't proved a crime, or they never went to the police, as if the two things equate.
Yeah.
And we're saying, no, we don't care what the legal definitions are because that failed me. We don't care whether it's something provable or not. We're saying that when someone's body is invaded, there can be a traumatic psychological injury that is invisible and needs first aid support.
Yes. So critical. I saw what you were just talking about, the 3 J's of trauma first aid, and read a little bit about it. Where has this been? I'm so glad you had that enlightenment and that moment where you were able to label, in good ways this time, put names to things that are common experiences, not just for law enforcement and victim advocates, but for friends and family and coworkers and supervisors. And in the military, that chain of command needs to better understand. There are so many aspects of what you are doing with your program that are critically important for society, for our culture, not just cops, not just detectives, but ER personnel.
Mandated reporters.
Absolutely.
And they know that they're supposed to call police, but that's all we know. That's all we know.
All right. It stops right there.
It stops right there. And the injury is not being dealt with. I'll tell you where the idea came from. I had a couple of moments of epiphany because it's not just the first aid part that I think is really important. That first aid, knowing first aid then is proactive, right? Yeah. You cannot learn CPR on YouTube while someone is having a heart attack. We're asking people to learn this in advance so that they can create an emergency protocol. And the reason this came to me is I was actually watching the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. The prosecution is ready to rest after 2 weeks. And I'm fearful this woman is going to get off. And I'm mad. I'm angry. And I said, after Sandy Hook, we have active shooter drills in every school in this country. And our kids are more likely to be sexually assaulted than ever be in an active shooter situation. And so I did the math on that, Dave. Do you know how much more likely our children are to experience sexual harm than ever be in an active shooter situation? 1,062 times more likely to experience sexual harm. And we have 0 pre-planned emergency protocols in place. Zero.
0 pre-planned emergency protocols, 0 understanding of that pervasiveness of childhood sexual abuse. And that carries on into adulthood because the number one predictor that you're going to be sexually assaulted is that you've been sexually assaulted in the past. I think as a society, we need to start becoming aware. That awareness, we have to have this discussion that you and I are having right here more often, more visibly, more loudly than we ever have before if we are going to see change in our culture. And I love that you are taking those steps to actually do that. This is phenomenal information.
Thank you. The second epiphany came for me when I started thinking about the idea of a psychological first aid, right? Like that makes sense, right? Well, there actually is a very, very well-known School of Public Health puts out a free class called Psychological First Aid. It was created by these 2 gentlemen professors. They've actually had this class for quite a while. It's mainly for those first responders in all sorts of situations. Dave, I decided to sign up for this free class. I was so excited. I was like, I'm going to learn so much, right? And I did this about 3 years ago during the pandemic. Do you know that in their book, And in the class, they do not mention sexual harm as being a factor needing psychological first aid. So I commented in the group, hey, I'm an Epstein survivor that's lived with post-traumatic stress disorder for the last 30 years, and you're missing this whole element of sexual harm as being of needing any psychological first aid. And this is a reputable university. So I put that in the community forum.
Right.
Never got a response. Saw they were coming out with an update to their book. So I was like, no one reached out to me to ask me, but maybe they updated it because they've done more current trauma education, right?
Yeah.
Because they mention everything. They mention mass shootings, they mention robberies, they mention earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis. They mention every kind of traumatic experience, suicide, everything except sexual harm. So their second edition comes out. The book is expanded. I was like, oh, good. Okay, they're including sexual harm. A paragraph has been added. So when I tell you, it's not even like those that are in law enforcement, an attorney, anybody that's listening to this that is in those ranks, it's actually not your fault that you don't know this. It's that you're not getting the information from even PhDs that are talking about trauma. And that's why I feel like my story is so important. For people to understand that I've been lucky enough to have a phenomenal trauma therapist to get to the other side of being able to explain what happened. Because when I started this, I could talk about it for 10 minutes and then I would either get headaches or nausea, or I'd fall asleep. I would have these physical repercussions. And then I'd be done for the day or sometimes days. That's it. Mm-hmm. And I slowly chipped away at healing until I was up to 20 minutes where I could write about it or journal about it, to 30 minutes. And I chipped at it every day for the last 4 years to be able to find my own words. I actually don't read other survivor stories because I was like, I want to find my words. I want to find my words that mean what I'm trying to say. I don't want to be confused by what anybody else is saying. I really want to figure out and rebuild my brain and nervous system in a way. And that's what I've been doing for years. I've been rebuilding my brain and my nervous system so that I can share this story, so that law enforcement and lawyers, I've had lawyers that even work with sexual assault survivors all the time, and they are the least trauma informed. Mm-hmm. And trauma informed gets thrown around, Dave. And I feel like just knowing that it exists is not the same thing as recognizing it's an injury that needs care first.
Absolutely. It is psychophysiological. It's psychological and physiological. It's physical in our bodies. We have got to be aware of that. But then knowing that is one thing. Applying it, like you're talking about, is a complete other thing. And that's the issue. I tell cops all the time in my trainings, what you just said. It's not that you're doing things wrong, because you're doing things right for what you were trained to do.
Or what you were trained.
You were trained wrong. Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. You weren't educated with this stuff. And that's not a big fault either. I mean, when I was in the academy, was in 1983, none of this language existed. Most of the science didn't even exist. We were just barely tapping into the psychological aspects of trauma back in the 80s and early 90s. How could we expect law enforcement to do any better when we weren't training them? But now it's something that I strive to do. It's why I'm so thankful that you are here, that you are saying what you are saying, because it's part of that educational process, not just to law enforcement, but to, like you just said, attorneys need this, doctors, nurses, even sex assault nurse examiners need to know more.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I went into the dentist because I tend to get very intrusive thoughts, and they're around teeth and things going under my fingernails. And so I was like, you need to know I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and my intrusive thoughts are around teeth. And so I'm going to have anxiety. And so I just want to prepare you. I've tried to get really assertive about saying this.
Absolutely.
So that people start to look out for it more. It has taken me these last 4 years to go, I did nothing wrong. It was never my fault. I don't have a stigma about it. I don't.
No.
I was injured just like as if someone had come along and they had barreled me over with a car. You know, there is no stigma on me. And so I'm going to keep saying sexual assault survivor, and I'm going to keep saying Jeffrey Epstein's name. I'm not going to back away from it. You know why? Because I can. Because I can. Sadly, Dave, this is why people will believe me. That's the sad part. This is why they'll believe me. And so I'm not saying it for any other reason why. At least you will listen to my conversation. You will listen to what I'm saying because of his name. And so if he got all of this attention, he got all of the things he got because of his name, then I am going to use his name to change this stigma.
So powerful. So good. Thank you. Thank you for all of this. Let's go back just a little bit if we could.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that you remember the day when you had that enlightenment moment of, I didn't do anything wrong. I can heal from this.
Yeah.
2017 is when the therapy started. Is that right?
2017 was when I first saw the adrenal fatigue specialist.
Oh, okay.
And then it was 2018. It has been a journey.
Yeah. So that's what I wanted to address. From day of when you were in tonic immobility, when you could not move, you could not shout, but your brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Hey, you should be screaming. Yes. You should be yelling. You should be fighting. You should be kicking. You should be pushing him off. You should be doing all of these things. Why aren't you doing this? And your body is just frozen. And that is the textbook example of what it means to be in total tonic immobility. You're frozen. Your body is rigid. You want to move, but you can't. You want to scream, but nothing comes out. From that moment on till 2018, Jess, life went on around you, and you were stuck, as you said, in that mindset of, I'm not safe. I did this. I'm to blame. Self-blame, self-shame. What happened to your career, and what happened on a daily basis that got you through each day? That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Be sure to tune in next week for the incredible conclusion of Jess Michael's story and how she survived the horrendous consequences of her rape and was able to conquer the state of being stuck and begin her healing journey. The fact that Jess is able to share this story with us is a tremendous testament to her incredible strength and desire to move beyond her torment to a productive and meaningful life that is dedicated to helping others. Thank you, Jess. You are helping us all. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for being here. I appreciate the fact that you're part of the SAS audience. As we come to the end of April and recognizing Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I want to encourage you all to do something meaningful and tangible to honor those who've been raped or sexually assaulted by contributing to a favorite rape or sexual assault prevention or treatment organization, if you're in a position to do that. If not, please continue to start by believing when it comes to listening to and providing support for victims and survivors, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.